And this is where we're going to look at what would a really effective, representative, robust Heritage Act look like? How would it be resourced? And what would be the best way to implement it?
We have a great panel here to help us in this final stage. I'll just introduce them from top to bottom there. So we've got Sheridan Burke, who's a heritage consultant, an original staff specialist member at the Heritage Council in 1978, and she's currently on the Opera House Conservation Council. We've got Alan Croker, who's one of the state's most experienced heritage architects, and he was, happily, we gave him the 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award for the National Trust as well. So thank you, Alan, for your contributions to the Trust over so many years. We have Duncan Marshall, a Canberra-based heritage consultant who's the former chair of the ACT Heritage Council and a former vice president of Australia ICOMOS. And Dr. McLaren North, who's an experienced archaeologist who has worked in a variety of heritage management roles within the government and is now the Managing Director of Extent Heritage. And I first came across McLaren when I did work experience at the Government Architect's Office in Year 10.
Thank you for making me feel old.
Yes. We need to, I think, recognise that heritage is within the planning system, and the planning system is essentially about the development of land, and that's not likely to change. So what do you think the current system is? Is it overly focused on process rather than outcomes, or where are we sitting at the moment?
So, yeah, I suppose the biggest thing that concerns me about the current system is a focus on process, and a lot of that, I think, has to do with some of the questions we've talked about, or the issues we've talked about in terms of the skill base, both within government and within the Heritage Council, having the right people who can make judgments rather than outsourcing them to people like myself. And I think somebody earlier was talking about how the National Trust was a bit of a timid organisation back in the day, and I think what we now have are timid government departments who don't want to make decisions and certainly don't want to make controversial decisions, and so push it to consultants to justify things or provide them with easy answers. And if we turn that around and said, well, the objects of the Act are about conservation, how do we look at projects in terms of conservation outcomes rather than development outcomes? That would be a big part of it.
If the processes were better resourced, we'd have better outcomes. I think one of the difficulties that we see in looking at those statistics is that the vast majority of heritage places across New South Wales are dealt with under local government, and they're not being dealt with under the Heritage Act, and they're not being dealt with under the Heritage New South Wales. Those people need to be resourced at a local government level and at the state level. And if you look at the objectives of the Act, it talks all about that. It says about supporting and promoting and assisting at those levels. But what we see now is less and less of that, unfortunately. Many of the documents and the technical guidelines that have been mentioned this afternoon are now 20 years out of date. They need updating. If those documents were around and able to be used by these owners that we're seeing segmented very interestingly on the board there, I think we would be a lot better off. So resourcing and technical support and advice, I think, is what's missing.
One of the conversations I was having with Jim Coleman over here was one of my observations across a number of jurisdictions has been that quite often heritage is reactive to the good or bad ideas coming forward from governments, developers, a range of people involved with heritage places. And what I wonder is if in this heritage utopia that we're all dreaming, that whether we can try and turn the tables around a bit and not quite be so reactive but rather be proactive. So, I mean, we were talking earlier in a side conversation about development of Parramatta. I mean, what's the sympathetic heritage development dream for Parramatta? I mean, what's the heritage-friendly outcome? We were using the word outcome. What's the heritage-friendly outcome for Parramatta? Work that out, develop that and present that with all the gloss and pizzazz that a developer would present a 70-storey building and then put that out there as the standard for what should happen in that locality. And I think, that sort of vision, that heritage-friendly vision for heritage places can happen at a wide range of scales, can happen at an individual heritage building or site or place, through landscapes, through urban areas and the like. And that seems to me to be one of the dreamy ideas I have about what this heritage utopia might be.
I think being proactive rather than reactive is a very key point, and I think that speaks to many of the things that we've been talking about today, whether that be the composition of the register, rather than waiting for a building to be under threat before we list it. We should actually be saying this building is good and we should list it, or this landscape is important and we should list it. So that's something that I think has applications on many levels. And we've been talking about these bigger projects and the way they sit in the planning systems, but I think a lot of people have been surprised to know that you can just turn off the Heritage Act. And can you tell us a bit more about how heritage sits within that context of state significant development and what impacts that's having?
It's one thing that I haven't been able to drill down on fully. I actually did a search of the SSDA documents that are available on the website and searched for the word heritage. And all it came up in was the definitions at the front of the document. It doesn't mention it anywhere else. So this is for somebody to do a bit of research in, where in that whole sort of system of interlinked documents does there exist a clause which says it turns off the Heritage Act? Because I know specifically for the Sydney Opera House and some other sites, it does not turn off the Act. And it's specifically, the Opera House is listed under a schedule which says that approvals are still required under the state heritage legislation. So I haven't been able to drill down to the bottom of that one, David.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No,
it's one of those things that I, being very cynical, have a suspicion that somewhere that has been buried in the system. And I think it's one of those nasty things because the SSDA, or State Significant Development process, deals with developments which are of a substantial size, and they are frequently places of considerable significance, whether they be all the sandstone buildings in Bridge Street or other places that the government wants to activate or divest themselves of. Liberate, I think was the term that was used. It turns off the Act for those things. So that means that the Heritage Council does not really have a say in that. They may be asked, but it's in certain cases, but I don't think it's really something which is taken to a great level of seriousness or, dare I say, credibility.
And I suppose a follow on from that, one of the recommendations in this paper is that we have these levels of significance, and what you've just mentioned there is once something gets to a bit higher level, the idea is that it would have more protection. What do you think about those sorts of recommendations?
I agree with the comment that was made before that these levels of significance are a bit of a distraction. I think that they can be used quite dangerously to marginalise those places that do have a certain level of, maybe it's local significance, but, at a closer investigation could be considered of state or national significance. I'm dealing with an Aboriginal place which is very much in that category. And I think that we run the risk of too many things walking through those gaps if we do that. I would like to see a system whereby, if a place has significance, then it needs to go through a certain assessment process and quite a rigorous way of assessing what changes are being proposed and how that is being arrived at.
I've been involved in a number of state significant development and state significant infrastructure projects, which have had quite a long list of heritage-related conditions of consent, but it becomes an exercise in managing a giant compliance schedule because the consent authority simply wants to say, right, clause 4.7.6.2. Oh, we've got a report that addresses that. Thank you. And to be honest, I suspect a lot of these documents are never looked at by anyone other than the consultant who prepares them.
And the National Trust. We read them.
Good. Glad to hear it.
But it is a key point that there's a bit of a box-ticking approach to heritage that's started to come about. And we've seen countless reports written, no offence, mate, by archaeologists commenting on buildings and vice versa. You know, and it's this sort of the people who are writing these reports often don't know what they're talking about, to be quite frank. And we've had one. You know, we sometimes look up who these people are. We've never heard of them, and yet they're writing the heritage impact statements for the Powerhouse Museum at Parramatta, which is a massive project, and we'd never even heard of them.
My larger point was more regulation and more conditions of consent doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes.
Duncan, did you?
I mean, I've only been involved in one state significant activity, I mean, it wasn't, I think it's still a work in progress, but the problem to my eye in that particular case was not that it could end up with a tick box outcome, but rather you were having one apparently well-credentialed heritage person provide advice that there was no impact, and you had another well-credentialed heritage person providing advice that there was significant impact. And for the professionals in the room, I think what we need to reflect on is that there's quite a variability in practice in terms of reaching decisions about probably listing decisions as well, or the finding of values, but also questions about impacts as well. And wherever you can, or some proponent can find a well-credentialed heritage person to agree with their development and view, then I think all of us, community, expert, whoever, will find it difficult to then argue our case because you know, there is ammunition on the other side to say there's no particular impact here. I just wanted to add one more thing about the listing proposal, these categories, and I think, you know, wearing my Australia Icamos hat, which is the role I'm playing here today, it seems to me that there's a great danger that this categories activity is confusing a listing activity with a management activity, and that what the problem that categorisation is trying to fix is a perceived problem with management and providing management guidance and management outcomes for particular places. But to call it listing is to, I think, completely confuse things, and there's been a very, very long principle in Australian heritage conservation practice that you keep listing decisions separate from management decisions, and so I think that should be a very strong message that everybody sends back to government.
I think the ability to understand what the community's expectations are is actually quite problematic. I think that government has one understanding, and perhaps all the people in this room have a slightly different understanding, and in between is where we need to be, because the expectation is not being fulfilled for any of us probably at the present time. I thought the expression that somebody had about looking at the state government assets, which is the vast majority of things that are on the State Heritage Register now, suggests that it's about liberating those assets and making them more work harder, which is also one of the terms there, work harder for the state at the present time. Now, all of those assets sit within local structures, as Rob so eloquently said. They are all local significance to the people who live around them. Those things need to be understood for the local people as well as for the state people, and I think that's where there's this kind of this mismatch of expectation, and somehow we need to bring that together. And I think that's one of the roles of this group today, is to make it clear that there is a strong feeling within the community that heritage is part of what we expect government to support us in looking after. And at the present time, we're not seeing that very frequently.
Yeah.
25% of the Australian population was not born in Australia. And I don't know that we're necessarily very good about making heritage relevant to a non-Anglo-based community. I just did a bit of statistical analysis before I sat down. The largest migrant groups in Australia are from England, India, and mainland China. And mainland China and India vastly outnumber the immigrants from places like England, New Zealand, and the United States. But I don't know that, if I was a Chinese migrant, why would I care about the Heritage Act? We're assuming we're making statements on behalf of the community at large, but there's actually a large portion of the community that I don't know that we've necessarily engaged with very well.
Yes.
You asked me a little bit about operationalising, and I think if I look out from this perspective, I see a lot of hair the colour of mine in the room, and I think that that is an issue for the heritage movement, that if I look at what's fundamentally different to when I started work in the Heritage Office and now, what I see is that communication is completely different. We're on the phone 24/7. We're not creating large files like I did when I joined the Heritage Office. Things have changed about communication, but the delivery of the Act hasn't. And I think that that's a really important thing that we need to consider. How can we be communicating better to people about what the heritage of New South Wales is? And I don't think it's as basic as the ethnicity, Mac. I think it's more about what you care about in your local area or what you care about in the society that you've come to be part of. So I'd see it as being something that's more about understanding heritage for what it is and helping people to do that.
I think it also comes back to just making sure that you consult with the relevant communities, which is a Borough Charter principle as well. And I know, particularly with Aboriginal issues, I'm involved with a couple of projects in that area. And one of the things that we find is that the Aboriginal people themselves are frequently not consulted, far too often, and they are not really provided with the mechanisms or support that they need to determine the future for their places. And I think this is a whole, this is a topic of much wider discussion, but I think that people like that need to be consulted first to determine what they believe is significant, and it'd be different for different groups, and they're not an homogenous group, just like the Greeks are not an homogenous group, and the white Anglos are not an homogenous group. They're very diverse opinions, but we need to make sure that those people are asked at a community grassroots level and then build up from there and supported somehow in trying to get outcomes which respect and retain the values that they have identified in those places.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the problems in reading the discussion paper is understanding what evidence there is for a number of the claims being made in the document. I wonder, in the same way that I think your question was about activation or making heritage relevant to communities. I mean, I guess I wonder to what extent we understand, what are the problems or gaps or deficits, or, are there people out there who, across a wide range of communities, cherish all sorts of different heritage, not necessarily related to their ethnicity or things like that, but we just don't understand that. I mean, what's the research capacity available to actually explore the problem? And then, Sherry's right to touch on the way in which we as a group perhaps engage with the world as compared to 16-year-olds or 25-year-olds or whoever it is. Again, where's the rocket science behind working out how to get messages to people about their heritage? I always remember the thing about you can see a problem, say, that people don't cherish heritage as a problem and work at it in a particular way, or you can see it as a challenge to actually explain to them, what is the heritage they have out there, why they should love and cherish it, how they can engage with it. The heritage system could pick that up as a challenge and try to do more.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've touched on a couple of times as well, is about that relationship between the Heritage Council and the administrative body that supports the Heritage Council, in terms of its engagement with both the community and the profession. In the past, there had been a lot more engagement. There were projects on various areas of ethnic heritage. There were various outreach programs to state agencies, to different areas of the profession, and unfortunately, that's all been pulled back. The shutter has come down, and we need to get, even more importantly than the specific wording of bits of the Act, we need the shutter back up.
Yeah.
So many of these, in the discussion paper, one reform proposal, which I'll just read out, which I just think is a classic, The Minister responsible for heritage could be responsible for determining, in consultation with the Heritage Council, the regulatory thresholds for standard exemptions, fast-track applications and standard applications for permits under the Act. This would ensure the application and exemption process is flexible in response to community need, making it easier for heritage owners to maintain and conserve their properties. The Minister's not going to be able to do that. He will override the other things. That's the potential for this sort of change, in that it hands even more control into the political processes rather than being back in the grassroots. As Mac said before, the Heritage Council and the Heritage Office, as it was known, used to have a wonderful array of resources and expertise that could be consulted and engaged with at an early level in consideration of any project. And so by the time you actually put your application in, there was a general agreement across the board about the right way to approach it. So it was a consultative process. The officers in the Heritage Division or Heritage Office were accessible, they had expertise, they mentored each other, and it was a really nice collaborative environment which ensured good outcomes. But then that changed by a number of different processes, but it changed and the shutters came down, those people were no longer accessible. Then the government, I don't know how it happened, basically dismantled the expertise in the Heritage Office and threw all of those people who had knowledge into different departments. They may have provided expert advice in those departments, but they could no longer be in the same room and say, what about we approach the problem this way? What about, we could think about this? So it dismembered what was a really good organisation, and some of the things that they're asking for reform here. How could we improve the current approval permit system? We'll put all those bloody people back together again in the same room and give them the ability to be able to learn from each other, collaborate with other professionals in the field to find the right solutions, and that would streamline the process, not these other things which are being proposed.
I think it's a really key point, but one of the key themes that we keep looking at this discussion paper is this sort of putting heritage to work, engaging with it in different ways, making it something that's viable, etc., etc. The paper claims that the Act is generally considered onerous, procedurally complex and adversarial to adaptive reuse. And yet one of the objectives of the Act is to encourage adaptive reuse. So I'm wondering where this disconnect is. And they've given the example of Piermont Bridge on the back, the last page of this document. And they've said that it's a successful example of adaptive reuse. Now, it's an old picture, it's still got the monorail on it, for goodness sake, but I always thought that the bridge got people from one side to the other, and that by letting people do that now, it's not really an adaptive reuse. So I find that a bit puzzling. How does the Act support adaptive reuse? And is it really stifling it? But is there also a limit to how much adaptive reuse we can have before we've gone maybe a bit too far?
My experience with the Act is that it's not stifling it per se, but sometimes the operation of the Act can be very slow. And again, it comes back to the resources. The ability for people to work through the processes that have been created takes time. And if they don't have that joint ability to have expertise, skills and knowledge and to confer with each other, I think it makes the process even longer. To be able to have a water cooler chat with Alan would solve the problem in 5 seconds, but to have to then write 3 emails and make 4 phone calls and all this sort of thing, it just doesn't work. So adaptive reuse is what's commonly happening all around the city, everywhere. Look at Millers Point. There's nothing down there that hasn't been adaptively reused one way and another. But for some people, it's probably taken a long time, and for other people, it's probably taken not enough time for them to consider what the issues really were. But I wanted to kind of push you a little bit away from the adaptive reuse into the question of landscape, because I was really interested in the question that came up, or the opinion that came up here, that 44% of the people in this room were concerned about the way in which landscape's being managed. Now, if we're talking talking about adaptive reuse, we tend to think about buildings, but adaptive reuse of the landscape, the way in which we're dealing with Indigenous country, the way in which we're dealing with cultural landscapes, like the Mulgoa Valley at the present time, those issues I think are really important to us all because we see those changes being very rapid and very irretrievable. So I'd suggest that how we handle and manage landscapes, cultural landscapes, Indigenous landscapes, how we understand the intersections is a really important thing that this paper fails to engage with. To me, the issues around Indigenous heritage are far more significant. The state should be dealing with them and dealing with climate change rather than dealing with trying to rewrite an act, the Heritage Act.
Yeah. I'm just interested in what McLaren might have to say from that archaeological point of view as well.
In relation to landscape?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the issue we've always had with archaeological landscapes has been they don't neatly match the modern cadastre. And so because you've got a development site that is this rectangle here, it may bear little or no resemblance to the significant archaeological landscape, be that an Indigenous or a historic one. And there was a grand, but in my view, failed experiment to try and do that in Parramatta about 20 years ago. And while there was a lot of great information generated by that project, it didn't get implemented into the planning system, and it didn't take that idea of that the important thing is not just what's in this box and what's in that box on the cadastre, but what's important is the relationship between them. So there is some merit in trying to improve the landscape approach, probably not just for archaeology, but certainly for the relationship between all kinds of heritage. But I don't know that the mechanisms in the Act at the moment support it.
Something that was brought up in the earlier panel, and we'll take Mulgoa as an example here, is that in the past there was an attempt to go around and list these individual items, whether that be Fern Hill, St Thomas Church, the Cox Cottage, these sorts of things, but in isolation. And now people are starting, and it's that Jim started to talk to this, people's understandings of things are changing now. And we're actually talking about, well, it's actually the bits in between those heritage items that helps give them that significance. You could put Fern Hill anywhere, but it's the fact that it's there and it relates to this other thing and the driveway and all the rest of the stuff. That's what makes it very important. How can we start to get the Act to talk about that as a way of adaptive reuse and these sorts of things, taking that landscape thing a bit further? Maybe Alan or Sherry.
Yeah, I mean, the Mulgoa Valley was a regional environmental plan. It was about how subdivision should occur, how landscaping should occur. It was the dots on the map, but it was definitely the whole of the valley.
Just speak into the microphone, Sherry.
Now, what we're finding is that the Erytropolis and the growth of Penrith itself are pushing at that region, and the strategic planning that's necessary through the planning system is letting these landscapes down. I think that there's no longer that clear integration and that respect for the way the regional plan was originally written, and maybe, yes, it probably needs to be updated. But unless we respect those plans and that knowledge, then it will just gradually, cumulatively be degraded. And that's the concern, I think, for the Mulgoa Valley right now.
Yeah. Alan, did you?
Yeah, I think it points out something which I think as heritage professionals, and I count myself as one of them, that we're often guilty of, is we identify a place and we identify its values and we take it up to understanding it to the present, but we don't think about how it may be able to go into the future. So it's about managing change. So I think one of the things that we have not done very well in the past is to identify what the issues may be around the future of a place, and you really have to look into a crystal ball and then work out a series of guidelines, principles, regions on a map or whatever, where you could say these areas are potential areas for change, and if change is imagined or considered in these areas, this is maybe the direction that change could take. It's not about finding design solutions, it's about identifying clearly where change can occur and what direction that should take, so that the values that you've identified in your analysis of the place are understood protected and celebrated into the future. If you don't do that, then you are stuck with something which is saying, well, we don't think this document or this study or this listing allows us to change anything. And that's a common perception out there, and it's what's driving, I believe, a lot of this change. People think because it's heritage listed, particularly if it's on the SHR, you can't change it. And that's complete rubbish. We all know that, you know. Look at what's happening down at the Opera House. It's on the World Heritage List. Major changes going on. But the values are protected.
And some of that is about, I suppose, building the understanding. Again, some of that goes to that outreach piece that we were talking about before, and some of that goes to developing the understanding with asset owners. Having worked a lot with industrial heritage and active industrial heritage, a lot of the work that I've done with asset owners, and I look at one of them who is significantly still in this room and still managing the portfolio that I used to help manage, was about ongoing use. It's not adaptive reuse, it's ongoing use, and what is an acceptable level of change to keep things in service. But there is a fetishization of the new sometimes that I think means people don't consider how places can be kept in use, unfortunately.
Well, and we have this issue with timber truss bridges, for example, where they're very important and we love them, but they were built with very big logs from very big trees that we don't actually like to cut down anymore. And where is that balance, and how do we strike that appropriate decision making? One of the other key things that's come up for discussion is this, and we talked a little bit about it here, is this mix of skills, not in the Heritage Office, but the first question, not just in the Heritage Office, but the Heritage Council, and one of the first question in the discussion paper is about that composition of the Heritage Council. Is there a utopia for our Heritage Council? Not necessarily in its composition, or maybe representation, but in its size and number. They've put this question out there, so I'd be interested to hear perhaps what we would be looking for, and perhaps how would that, what's that ultimate point, I suppose, where the community would then really trust this Heritage Council to be the protector of the state's heritage. I'll leave that open, but...
I'm happy to take a first stab at that.
Yeah, go.
I'll make a confession. I was the one who wrote the paper for the changes to the Heritage Council in the 2007 review of the Act. So that is the reason the Heritage Council is 9 rather than 14. That was a benchmarking exercise that was undertaken as a part of that legislative review. I think it's less about the number of people than about the skills composition. And I was discussing this with somebody earlier. There is a laundry list of skills, but there's no requirement that there is a balance in terms of how those skills are applied.
Yes, I think that's a key point.
The other thing that we were discussing at our table is, again, these various advisory committees that used to exist to supplement the expertise of the Heritage Council have largely been done away with. And many of us in this room volunteered many, many hours on those committees, and probably would do again if we were given the opportunity, but most of those committees don't exist.
Alan, you were looking ready to...
I think that's absolutely right. The people that the Heritage Council seems to represent now is more skewed to be able to my, again, cynical viewpoint, to allow the development lobby or the government's agenda to have greater sway over the decisions of the Heritage Council. And I think that's really unfortunate. It used to have, when I was there as an alternate to Richard Mackay, when he was on the Heritage Council, and I was on one panel and Richard was on another, and I was on various other advisory groups as well. It was skewed towards people who actually had expertise in those areas, whether it be archaeology, town planning, architecture, all of those areas. Now those areas have been played down, and I think that a lot of us are reluctant to really volunteer for some of those things now because there's no power to have any influence over those decisions. It's basically been emasculated.
Mention of the name of Peter James, who was an Australia ICOMOS member and a director of the National Trust in New South Wales, drafted this a long time ago. And his view, which came through as the agreed view of Australia ICOMOS, was that The Heritage Authority this is guidelines or objectives for legislation across Australia. The Heritage Authority must be a representative body of informed members with appropriate skills. The majority of members should have skills in conservation, heritage conservation. Representatives of other interests may be included, but not so as to make the authority too large to be workable. And I mean, others will have experiences of working with heritage councils or authorities and the like. And, you know, one of the things when I was chair of the ACT Heritage Council was that there was great suspicion, the fact that there was development interests represented on my council. And it was only one person, and that person changed. You know, there were a cycle of people coming on and going off. But I actually did find the contributors from property, building industry, whatever it was, to be a very useful contributor to the work of the council. But the work of the council is fundamentally about heritage conservation, so you need people with skills and expertise in heritage conservation. And my ACT council also did have some degree of community representation as well. I mean, however the minister, you know, grabs people and decides to put them on. But, you know, that kind of work. There's no magic formula, but those kind of principles seem to work.
Say one thing, I think skills and experience are really important, but I think that can be very broadly cast. I think there has to be knowledge. There has to be knowledge of the heritage of New South Wales in all its forms and shapes. That really needs to be fundamental.
A deep knowledge. I always feel intimidated when I have to chair a panel of people like this, you know. But that's it. It's about that deep knowledge and experience, skill set, long understanding of places. That's what actually makes a good council or a committee. And not necessarily the numbers, as you say, Mac. It's about who's on it and what they bring to it. There's one thing that is noticeably silent in the discussion paper is archaeology, and there are a number of archaeologists here that have told me that as well. McLaren, I'm going to obviously steer this to you. What do we need to change in the Heritage Act, or do we not need to change anything?
It's an interesting question. So some of you may recall there was a fundamental change in 2007, which was the getting rid of the 50-year rule for significance and actually saying that archaeological places needed to be assessed as having state or local significance. And I think that was a really important change, and it's still a relevant change. Being not on the tools anymore, it's a little bit more difficult to say how the Act is or is not working in practice. I mean, I suspect that talking to my staff, who I rely on for a lot of that these days, that the process issue still is a problem, and certainly we are finding our work is being reviewed by people who lack knowledge in archaeological heritage and will dispute our findings from a position of ignorance. And so it does become adversarial when you're having to go back and tell someone who is a town planner, for example, who says, but we think you should do some archaeology there, and we say, well, this is the assessment and we haven't found anything significant, so we don't think it's necessary. Or contrary, there is something very significant here and we think the development should be modified. So I don't know that that's necessarily a legislative problem. I think it's more an administrative one.
And that's a point in itself.
David, I just want to say one more thing about the role of heritage councils and authorities, and that's that I have a very strong view that they work best for the overall system and the community when they're an active, vocal public champion for heritage, independent public champion for heritage in their jurisdiction, and it's kind of difficult in some ways for them to play that role because they can be busy people with full-time jobs otherwise, and so, you know, doing a couple of hours of media in a given day can be quite a difficult thing to do. But nonetheless, I mean, I think the community, when heritage councils and authorities were created as part of that sort of 1970s wave of legislation, I think the community had a great high hope that heritage would now be safe. That you know, they didn't have to rely on the BLF or, you know, community groups themselves to be doing all the heavy lifting. That
someone else could step in now.
Someone else could, with a big, powerful voice. And unfortunately, and you know, heritage councils perhaps come and go in their ability to do this, but I think it's kind of got to be stamped on their forehead that that's kind of a big role that they should play, and independent of government in a way. And government needs to be respectful that they need to be able to be out there and be the champion.
There's a major difference between our heritage legislation in New South Wales and that in Victoria, in that our Heritage Council is basically an advisory body to the minister, whereas in Victoria, the Heritage Council's recommendations for a project or a listing cannot be overturned or contradicted by the minister. So it's an independent voice which has clout. Our Heritage Council does not have that clout.
Is there a way in the administrative provisions of the Act to speed up both the listing and potentially the delisting process? Because there are things that are on the State Heritage Register that do need to be reviewed.
Yeah.
And the process for doing either is extremely administratively burdensome.
And get this register up to where it needs to be and representative of what it should be.
I think that would be a really positive recommendation to be making, because whilst that was the original objective, that there would be heritage studies done, they would be done both regionally and locally, the investment that happened in those has fallen by the wayside, and they all started in the 1980s, I guess, were the first ones, and they need to be both reviewed and regenerated, because, as we've all said, heritage moves on and it evolves and different things are seen as being significant. If there was a recommendation that says, I think blitz is a fairly unfortunate word, but if we really had a big focus on understanding what the heritage of New South Wales is, that would give a level of certainty to people who were looking after it as to how they were going to have to look after it and what their expectations could be. So whilst that sounds like a big ticket item, and it probably is, there's a really strong base in what we know now to do that kind of review, and I think that might be something that's worthwhile thinking about as a recommendation.
And yet, Sherry, over a period of time, the Commonwealth, with Commonwealth funding support, all of the states were encouraged to do a kind of systematic review of what was the heritage of their jurisdiction, and that was kind of one body of work that was done. So it was possible at that point in time. We just seem to have lost that priority and resourcing and ability to revisit that, to expand definitions of heritage where they need to be expanded, and to again have a sort of systematic approach.
And I tell you, these days, with the value of property and the stakes, if somebody goes to the Land and Environment Court and Council's got a statement of significance that says this property is significant in the local area, the court will say that's a piece of garbage. We can't use that. And so there is a need, even at the local level, for comprehensive local heritage listings. And there has been a real reluctance from a lot of local governments to fund that.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Lots of more questions come in. There's been close to 150 through the day. If they could make one change, what would the panellists suggest they make?
I would say the very few tweaks may be required to the Act, because I think the Act is very robust and quite all-encompassing. There may be a few little bits that need adjusting, but I think it's basically providing the Heritage Division or the Heritage Office, whatever they are called today, and whichever department they're in, but providing them with the resources they need to carry out the objectives of that Act. Because so many of these review questions are about questioning the performance. The problems have arisen because things are being frustrated by time or whatever, or processing, and that's because of under-resourcing.
The most popular question was in fact a question about why wasn't anything related to the Section 170 raised in the paper and raised
And that's
as a
what
reform.
I would fix. Section 170 was gutted a number of years ago.
Yep.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add on Section 170 there?
Or one line?
I've dealt with a couple of projects that have actually fallen between the 170 stool and the State Heritage Register stool when there was supposed to be a transfer across. And it just fell in the gap between.
Right.
David, can I just add my one change that I would make? And it's not my area of expertise, but it comes from the Australia ICOMOS membership that's helping with the response to the review, and that's the legislative change would be to develop a modern Aboriginal Heritage Act. as a priority rather than focus on this act. Yes. Because that seems to be a long-standing problematic piece of legislation which has not been fixed and doesn't look like it's getting fixed anytime soon, and that really seems to be a priority that does need to be addressed.
I think it was interesting, the Minister had said as well that he was keen to modernise legislation. He actually said he would be starting with a new Aboriginal cultural heritage regime. That was the Minister's words, not mine. So yes, that.
And start with the Uluru Statement and take everything from there and ask Aboriginal people how they want the Act administered.
I think if I could make one change, it would be to link heritage better to sustainability, to what the issues are around that topic. Heritage is just part of that bigger question. It's part of the climate change question. It's part of the sustainability question. And while we keep putting it in this little corner, we're not actually engaging with the bigger issue. So that would be my change.
How do you knit heritage back into the fabric of, I guess, what you would think of as contemporary concerns, or the more pressing, politically salient concerns that people have in the community? And clearly, as you say, there is a role for it.
Can I just add a rider to that? Because there's one problematic part of the discussion paper, or at least one problem.
You need to read it again.
and that's where it talks about, before deciding to add an item to the State Heritage Register, the Minister should consider not only if reasonable and economic use would be affected by the listing, but also what opportunities there are for adaptive reuse and activation. I mean, I'd come back to that point I made earlier in the panel, that listing and management need to be kept very separate because it becomes a very murky picture. I mean, the number of times where listings have been opposed because of perceptions of management issues, I mean, you just get a very murky outcome in terms of decisions about heritage listing. So happy for sustainability to be in there, but not if it's tied into the listing process. I mean, certainly in terms of the management and the ongoing.
I mean, interpretation often is included as a condition of consent in development now, and often as an afterthought, and usually without very thoughtful consideration of how or why interpretation is being done.
Yeah.
For me, interpretation is the ultimate conservation action. It should be part of every conservation project and every initiative. And I look, interpretation runs from fabulous websites like the Walter Burley Griffin Society to Instagram accounts that suddenly open your eyes to socialist modernism. You know, there's a whole range of interpretation. We shouldn't just see it as being the interpretation plan that's a condition of consent with the DA. It has to be there right from the start. And I think that it's really clear from the way the objectives of the Act have been written that interpretation and telling the stories of places is what will bring people along the journey with us. It's that virtuous circle. You know, if you understand it, you'll enjoy it and you'll care about it and you'll conserve it. I think that virtuous circle is what we want to be sort of arguing for, I think.
There's been a fair bit of discussion about where to from here for this event. We would like very much to help continue this conversation with you. There's a suggestion that each of your tables might, to help us help you, rather than have everyone here write to us all of your concerns, maybe if one suggestion is if you could get one person on your table to say, these are the key points that our table thought of. Could you send that, please, to the National Trust just via email? That would help us. The other point to make is that we will make available some of the information we have presented today, and we're going to try and continue the discussion with you as we progress our own submission. We will try and give some guidance to you to help you write yours. They're your submissions, not ours, but we'll try and help you do that as well. I'd just like to get the National Trust CEO, Debbie Mills, to close the event. But before I do that, I just want to thank Debbie as the CEO for letting us have this event. I think it's been a really great day for the National Trust, and I particularly just myself want to thank Jane Alexander, the Advocacy Manager. I simply just said, let's have a forum, and this is what happened, and that's thanks to Jane, so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
You know, when the Heritage Act review came out, we knew it would be significant, we knew people would care, but today has really demonstrated that. the combination of representatives from local council, community groups, individuals, members, people that work in government, that work in heritage experts here today is amazing, and we really appreciate you coming and sharing your views. I'll reiterate what David said, that it's really important, and Matt Devine, on our table, we need the notes of what we talked about today from each of the tables. Yeah, he's nodding. So get someone to nod at your table and collate that and send it into info@nationaltrust.com.au. It will help us all. I want to follow up what David said about the importance of membership as well, and I know a number of people have joined today, but truly we're a membership organisation. We only function through our members, and so it's wonderful that people have signed up, and I really encourage you to do that in the future. A few final thank yous for the day: our panellists, our supporting organisations, our ongoing corporate members of the Trust. I also want to acknowledge the staff. I know David did that as well, but truly, the complexity of bringing together today in really what was only a couple of weeks was amazing. So please, once more, thanks to David Burdon and Jane Alexander. And whilst I know they are truly grateful for that applause, their true thanks will be in every person in this room and every person you know making a submission, no matter how small or large, in relation to this review, because it's all of those voices that will be so important in terms of this review. So thank you again for your attendance, and we look forward to the next reiteration of this type of forum in the future. Thank you.